Hello, folks. Welcome back to CrimsonCast. I am Galen Clavio. He is Scott Caulfield. We are back. We're here to talk IU football as the Hoosiers enter into their second game of the year, their first game at home, their first game in the brand new Memorial Stadium, and unfortunately, maybe their first game ever, like completely on a body of water. There's some significant weather moving into town, which we're going to talk about.
There was a game a couple years ago against Iowa where I felt like it rained a ton.
It rained. Well, there was the game against Michigan State a couple of years ago, the one that they won, where it rained a decent amount. And that Iowa game, it was more, I think it was just icky the whole day. Like there was some rain, and there was like freezing rain at the beginning, but I know what you're talking about. Now this is like potential monsoon type conditions. We'll give the weather update a little bit later on. But Scott, first of all, how you doing?
Hey, we're 1-0, man. 5 games away from a bowl.
That's right.
Winning record.
That's right.
I'm good.
It's exciting times, and it's one of those situations where I think as we'll talk about, there's going to be a lot of good stuff for us to kind of unpack as far as what happened last week in the game versus FIU. Kind of a scary situation with the FIU players, by the way, this week. I don't know if anybody saw this, but a couple of players were actually shot. Non-life-threatening injuries, but our thoughts go out to those folks, and hopefully nothing more untoward happens than that. But no, I mean, on the football field, IU played a pretty good game overall. Certainly there was some things that we could be concerned about, but there was also some things I think that we can be positive about as we head into this next week's contest. So let's go ahead and quickly break down our kind of week after thoughts for that Florida International game. Scott, you got a chance to watch it. You've had a chance to digest it for a little while. What was your big takeaway, I guess, internally from having watched that game?
Penix.
It's just, have you just been repeating it mantra style while laying in the darkness in your bed? Like, is that?
It's like, I mean, it reminds me of like when you played NCAA football 12 or 13, you got that like first recruit, and then you get to just play with them. And it's like, oh my God, like this guy's fun to play with. That's the main thing I took away. I mean, we can talk about Cole Guest. Like that sucks. Like we're even more thin at running back. I've been through this too long, and I say I trying to get too high, too low, and yet I was texting you in the first couple minutes of the game being too low. But it's you don't want to take away too much because we don't know really how good FIU is or isn't. But it wasn't like a blow the doors off performance. But you know what? We won, and again, like Penix looked really pretty good. I think what's interesting, I was like talking to my dad, a couple other people, there still seems to be some, concern about Ramsey out there. I thought Ramsey looked pretty good too. Like I came away being like, I feel pretty good about our quarterback play. And like we said on this podcast, because we're smart people, like our skill position play, like running back and wide receiver, there seemed to be some good stuff there. It seems to always be the line and the defense kind of where we always come back to. But yeah, I mean, put it down to word, Penix. That's my word for the day.
I think I was most impressed with the line, the offensive line. It was something that we heard about throughout the course of the offseason that, the line last year was problematic and, there were injuries and they weren't very effective. And that's going to be a much improved area for this IU team. And I really think that they were in this contest. They figured out a way to give a lot of time, I thought, to whoever was in at quarterback, whether it was Penix or whether it was, our buddy Peyton Ramsey, and through
friend of the pod,
Peyton Ramsey. You look across the board at what IU was able to do. I mean, they did a good job in terms of getting rushing yards. I think on the game, what did they end up with? Like there's a 4.73 yards per carry average. And that's nothing to sneeze at. You look at, certainly not having Cole Guest in there and certainly not having Morgan Ellison, you would have thought that the running game might have struggled. And even though nobody got an excessive number of yards, everybody managed to get a decent number. And then, you go back and look at what Peyton Ramsey was able to do, what Michael Penix were able to do. You had to like the fact that, there weren't a whole lot of times where you felt like they were pressured or hurried. And granted, you're talking about playing against FIU, and there are certainly going to be a lot better teams that this IU squad will end up playing against. But I like the foundation that the offensive line set in this contest.
Yeah.
So I think, obviously as we move forward, this is a step up in competition, and this is a Virginia team that IU beat last year on the road. A little bit of a surprise. It was a game that IU was struggling in at the beginning. They end up substituting Peyton Ramsey in place of Richard Lego, who had started at quarterback. And
a game where you screamed in a Newark airport, right?
I did, yes. I frightened the Southwest terminal at the Newark airport while this game was going on.
Why I remember that. I can't, I forget my kids' names sometimes. I remember where you were with the Virginia game.
It was quite exciting. I even paid for the Wi-Fi on the flight from Newark back to Indy just I could follow the remainder of the game, because I was like, wow, this is great. This is certainly the start of something huge, and it really wasn't. But it was at least it was a fun game, and it was a road game against a Power 5 opponent. Yeah. That those are games that IU has struggled to win. Now, that said, they're going into this contest, if they think that game had anything to do with what's going on in this game, hopefully they disabuse themselves of that notion quickly, because this is a very different Virginia team, new quarterback, kind of a new offensive system. And it's a team that, while they only beat an FCS opponent in this last week, they certainly looked the part of a much better team. And, so as we go into this, and we got some questions from the audience we're going to address, one of the things to keep in mind is, this idea that Virginia, while they certainly didn't play very well last year, that has very rarely been any sort of a harbinger for IU one way or another as far as what's going to happen the following year. You can go back. IU lost to Missouri at home. They turned around and beat Missouri, I believe, the following year. They beat Bowling Green at home. They turned around and lost at Bowling Green the following year. Even in conference,
didn't we beat Navy on the road and then lose to them at home? Or
no, we lost. Versa? We lost that Navy. I think we lost all of the Navy games.
Did we? Okay.
We had a shot late, and I think Sudfeld. That was like Sudfeld's freshman year.
Okay.
Or sophomore, but he threw an interception late, and we ended up losing that game. But there's very little carryover, it seems like, for IU from year to year. So, so I guess going into this, let's start on the IU side. What needs to improve from last week to this week for you to feel like they've got a shot at winning this contest?
I would say that the defense has to just seem to have a little more control over the game. It did feel like that our defense, while, we did hold FIU to 28 points and we held them to less points than we had, it never felt like our defense was really able to ever take control of the game. We did have the big plays with the pick six and the turnovers. So that was good. And like we talked about in our post-game podcast, that's something we don't normally see. Is we don't normally see the defense have kind of those game-changing or field-turning plays. But I think for me, I need to make sure and see that the defense can kind of take a step up a little bit and have some of those 3 and outs or kind of times where we feel like we need the defense to step up once to do that. I would also say 1A is the things that were working well need to continue to work well. Like, I think we need to see our running game continue to work well. Passing and receiving need to go well. Like, again, this has always been kind of the whack-a-mole issue with IU football. Is like the defense does well, then all of a sudden, like, Ramsey melts down, and then we can't get any, offense doesn't move. And so when we have to keep doing what we're doing well and then shore up some of the other things.
Kind of tying off
kind of
of
an
that. Well, it is, yeah. I mean, I'll try to zero in on it a little bit. So let's zero in using a couple of user questions. So Patrick writes in, what was your biggest defensive concern? I'll go with inability to pressure the quarterback. No real pressure on the QB. Let them take some deep shots down the field. Against FIU, it didn't hurt them, but against better teams, it might. That was certainly somewhat of a concern, although I don't think I see that being a bigger problem in the future, not so much in this game, because I don't think that this Virginia quarterback is going to necessarily make IU pay if there's not a lot of pressure on him. I do agree, though, that was a concern. I think what I'll go with is I was overall kind of disappointed in how the veterans on the IU defense played. And you could certainly throw the pass rush in there. I think the defensive line did not really seem coordinated in what they were doing. I think that the experienced players in the secondary, with the exception of Jonathan Crawford, I think had some questionable games. I think certainly Ashawn Riggins had a tough start to the season with some penalties and had a couple other situations where I think he looked out of position. So I really think it's that. And it's one of those deals where, if you look at the way that this IU defense is going to have to set up, they're going to have to get leadership from the veterans, the few guys that have been out there and have really played a lot of downs as starters for IU, and there aren't that many of them. I mean, between 4 and really between 3 and 5 players, I guess you could say, on the defense. So that I think was the thing I was the most concerned about, was the fact that we didn't get more consistent play from the top. There was certainly a lot of rotation among the rookies and among the guys who hadn't played a whole lot, but we needed to see more from the guys that had been there before. And I think that certainly against a team like Virginia that is running, an option style offense and has a dual threat quarterback, you're going to that option offense. We saw this against Navy a few years ago, a couple of times. That'll really confound a team that is struggling to, still figure out exactly where it's supposed to be on the field. That's something I'd like to see addressed a little bit better from this the veterans on the IU defense moving forward.
I'd like to quickly revise my answer.
Please.
Because I now kind of locking back into that game. I would like to see us just look a little. You mentioned some of the penalties on defense, like that end of the first half kind of debacle of a play call and then a botch, missing the chance at a field goal and pushing it out. In the second half, having some crazy penalties, like too many guys in the field for a field goal. Like I would like to see this team look a little more sharp and a lot of some of those silly penalty mistakes kind of tightened up. A hold here and there is okay. Pass interference here and there. Like I get that. It's the too many men on the field, mismanagement of play clock. Like that's the kind of stuff that those things really doom you in Big Ten play. So I'd like to see that cleaned up for a game now.
A couple other questions that we got from the audience. There was one in particular that was interesting to me. Let's see. Well, how does our D stop the combo quarterback? I think it could give up 250 yards on the ground. That was from Howard S. I don't know, Howard. And certainly what's going to happen is going to be confounded even further by the weather. And I guess maybe, Scott, this is as good a time as any for us to get to the weather forecast. We had a comment in the chat from Brian Tonsoni. No usual tailgate setup for him this week, turning the van into a mobile man cave with futons, sub sandwiches, beer, and iPad to watch football in the back with the hatch open. I like that setup. That sounds like a pretty good setup. For those
people I was going to go to a tailgate with actually just texted me, Carol and Jeff. They said they're not doing it. Like they just canceled literally right now.
Yeah, and I've pretty much canceled my tailgate as well, which I feel bad about. But folks, if you haven't looked at the weather forecast, it really doesn't look good, and somehow has progressively gotten worse every time I've checked it. So the forecast right now for Saturday, starting at about 8 a.m., is for basically constant rain all the way through until about 8 a.m. the following day. And the forecast right now is for 3.36 inches of rain to fall in Bloomington on Saturday. That's a lot of rain. There's actually a flash flood watch in effect already for Bloomington. Of course, this is the remnants of Tropical Storm Gordon that are moving up through through the South. This is the second year in a row that a tropical event will have affected IU football in some way. Of course, last year it led to the FIU game getting canceled. But then that was a different sort of situation because it was a travel thing. But this is going to make for an extremely messy football game. Not as messy as it would be if IU played on natural turf, but still pretty messy. And it's one of those games, Scott, where you look at it and you say it's going to be really hard to throw the ball if you're talking about 3+ inches of rain and winds that at game time are probably going to be in the 13, 14 mile hour range steady. That's probably going to equate into gusts in the 20 to 30 mile an hour range, if not a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, looking at AccuWeather, there is the rain chart for Saturday. Although it's at 8 o'clock, it's only 49% chance of rain. So
yeah,
you might get a break there for an hour.
I'm not seeing that. I'm on the Weather Underground page, and that definitely is 100% chance of rain basically the whole time.
Yeah, it's like 70% to 40 to 50. I mean, it's whatever. It's going to rain. It's going to be a little bit wet. Yeah, I mean, it kind of sucks. This is like the unveiling of the new stadium because it's like
I know, no, it's terrible. I feel it's like I was
game day's not here.
Well, no kidding. Yeah, I was so excited about first game of the year. Evening kickoff, full day of tailgating, and then you go in, brand new stadium, atmosphere is awesome. And I mean, this is the exact polar opposite. It's not even going to be that warm. I think by game time, it's only supposed to be probably 65, 66 with just a drenching rain. I mean, this is pneumonia weather, basically. It's not.
I mean, it's going to be, you're going to lose any home field advantage that you had. because I think very few people are going to tailgate. A lot of people might show up or might just half be there. I mean, I could see a really dismal crowd. And not knock. I mean, this is not like getting all the fans when you cry. This is just really bad weather. It's not like one of those things too where it kind of like people are. It's Thursday night and we're already talking about how bad it's going to be in 3 days, and it only looks like it's going to get worse. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting. I think it's going to put a lot of, it's going to change a lot of plans. It's going to put a lot more pressure on a running game. It kind of makes me wonder too if it's a close game, because throwing is going to be pretty hard, and that's kind of what Penix is really good at. Is this a spot where maybe you just don't play Penix just because his advantage may not be useful? And it's like, why, again, like maybe if you're going to still think about redshirting him, this is kind of a spot where if you can get up like 14 to 3 or 21-7 or something, do you just, all right, let's just, play conservative with Peyton?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it depends on the mobility factor. That was really what I think Virginia struggled with last year to some degree. They were not expecting a mobile quarterback.
Right.
And, because obviously, I mean, Richard Lego, he had some good things going for him. Mobility was not one of those things. And, having to deal with Peyton Ramsey and being able to roll out of the pocket or being able to scramble, that threw them for a loop. They're not going to be tricked by that this time. But, obviously you've got two guys on the roster who can play quarterback who are more mobile than Ramsey. And maybe if you're looking at this and you're saying, well, we're not going to be able to throw the ball that well, perhaps we should just try to use the quarterbacks and kind of give Virginia a taste of their own medicine, really try to use an option style attack. You've got your offensive line. Your offensive line is obviously going to be able to block. And in a rain-soaked field, it's much better to be the team moving at an opponent than the team that's having to back up as somebody comes at you. So I actually wouldn't be shocked if all three quarterbacks played in this game, given what we think the conditions are going to be. You're going to want people with sure hands. And, I feel like, any of your quarterbacks at this point, they all carried the ball in that first game and they all seem to have pretty good ball security. I would feel fairly confident with that if that's exactly how we're going to go with things. I do think that certainly, I would be shocked at this point if they decided to redshirt Penix for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
So I'm not worried at this stage as far as like, are we going to be able to preserve those 4 games? I get the sense he's going to end up playing in a lot of games this year, just the way that he got utilized in that first contest.
For the love of God, though, I mean, like for the fans who are going to be there, and I'm still like 50-50. If I have a 5.5-year-old son, I'm debating like just putting a poncho and just having some fun with it and just getting a poncho and just being wet. But for the love of God, like, can we just all agree to not have a Kevin Wilson style 4.5-hour game? Like, for the fans who are going to be there, like, let's just bang this thing out in 320. Like these, and I will say the game against Florida International was better, but like, it's going to drive me nuts if this thing is, 7:30 start, if it's going to like 11:30 at night and people are still just being drenched. It's like, I'm joking, but like, let's just get this thing out under 4 hours.
Well, I think if this is truly a rain, if it's rain from the get-go and both coaches know that, I mean, what causes those games to go ridiculously long that you're talking about is passing. Yeah. I don't see a lot of passing going on if there's 3 inches of rain and there's a 20-mile-an-hour wind gust coming across the field.
Sure.
So the chances of this being a relatively quick game because both teams are running the ball seems fairly high. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Let's get to some other comments and questions. We had some comments in the chat. If you'd like to chime in on chat, by all means do so. Of course, if you're not listening live, catch us next time. But we had some other comments here. Jason Kennedy chimes in, Weather Underground is the real MVP, which it definitely is. Aaron Johnson says, if you don't go to the game, where is the go-to for you guys? Well, Scott has to come in from out of town.
Yes.
So I'm assuming that your go-to is your basement, right?
I have a 120-inch projection TV in my basement, which you've joined many times. And I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. So my go-to is the CrimsonCast 2 studios in the basement. Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, if I'm going, obviously I live in Bloomington, but if I don't stay at home because I have small children as well, hit the microphone there. Sorry. I will say that from the standpoint of the places that I will generally go to watch a game, certainly Yogi's used to be a place that just seemed like a natural to go watch football, but that's gone now, RIP. But Nick's obviously is kind of I think the standby if there's spots available, and normally for football games you can get a pretty good seat to watch a game. I will say that just to throw a shout out to another establishment in town that actually ended up being pretty good for sports watching. If you haven't been to Switchyard Brewing Company on North Walnut, it's worth checking out. I was watched some World Cup games there this summer, and was really impressed with the overall setup. There were plenty of TVs. There was a nice ambiance. It was a nice open floor area, and it wasn't that noisy. There are other places that I really like going that, because they've got cover bands or they've got musicians or whatever, or just loud noises. Sometimes it can be difficult to watch the games. But so far, so good with Switchyard. So that might be a place to check out. Let's see some other comments in the chat. Kent Davis saying, hoping the defense plays better. Also need the running game to play well with the possibility of heavy rain. Passing might be difficult with the rain. Bryce Kepner chimes in with IU needs more pressure on the quarterback this game. So generally agree with all of those. Let me get to a couple other comments here. Patrick says, based on game one, what skill position group impressed you the most? He says, I'll go with wide receiver, tight end, just deeper than expected group. Hale stole the show, but Timian and Wap didn't disappoint. Freifogel looks promising, and Bjorson Hendershot impressed, and that is leaving out Westbrook. And that seems like the pretty obvious answer, Scott. I'll say, actually, I'm going to chime in with quarterback because obviously, yes, wide receiver ended up being deeper. It looked like there were two functional throwing quarterbacks and a third guy who could run the ball and be pretty shifty with it. And that certainly was not the case last year for this IU team. And really, you could make the argument that IU has struggled to have more than one functional quarterback at any time throughout the course of the last several years. So the fact that there's some depth there at probably the most important position, and at a position where IU has had injury problems on a pretty consistent basis, I was pretty impressed with the quarterback setup.
I mean, I don't know who was playing because, there's no names in the jersey. So I really don't I don't know who was who. It's tough to tell. They were
like all video games. It's like, oh, WR87 is in.
You took mine with quarterback. That said, I will I'll go out there and I'll say I'll say running back. Just because I think the other two are also really good answers, but just to keep it fun, overall you have an average of 4.7 yards a carry. That includes Peyton Ramsey, but he had 4.5, so he's dragging the average down. You had average with the running backs of at least 4.7 or higher. You have on minimal carries, but you have Taylor Reese with 13. Wap Fillier with 11.5 yards a carry. Stevie Scott had the most, but he's 3.5 yards a carry. For a group that we didn't really know much about, and for having Morgan Ellison, your leading rusher from last year, out, to have a very pretty functional running game and a running game that never seemed to really get caught in the mud, I was pretty impressed with that. So I would go with running back.
A couple other questions that I wanted to get to from our listeners. We appreciate everybody that wrote in, by the way. So from Bayern fan 00, I think this is my old friend from the Peegs message board, actually. I'm curious, given that Penix looked solid last week, if Ramsey struggles in this game, does he get a quick hook, or is it better to let him work through it? We have such a small margin of error for wins to get a bowl game. Can Allen afford to let Ramsey work through struggles? I think it's an interesting question. I do think that if you look at the way that this particular game sets up with the rain, I don't know how you would tell if a guy is struggling. I guess if he drops the ball 5 or 6 times, obviously you got to take him out. But but I do think it brings up a larger point that I don't think applies to this game, but certainly would apply to Ball State and beyond, which is if Penix looks good and Ramsey is struggling, can you afford to let Ramsey play through? To be somewhat fair, I think you'd ask the same question if Penix was starting and Ramsey was on the bench. I do think there's a utility in letting quarterbacks play through a little bit of trouble. It's not like every guy's going to come out and play well consistently for 60 minutes every single game. That's very rare that happens. And if you think back to, say, Nate Sudfeld's struggles, early on in his career, I mentioned that Navy game where he threw a bad pass. We've had, there were some other games where Nate didn't exactly light the world on fire, but I think that set the stage for what he was able to do in his final year. And I think that a lot's going to be revealed in the next like maybe not this Virginia game, but certainly the Ball State game, certainly the Michigan State game, and then I think by the Rutgers game, that collection of games, we're going to really get a sense of whether Peyton Ramsey can be the starting quarterback that really, seizes command, I guess, of the season. And I look at it and I say to myself, well, as much as I'd like to see Michael Penix play more, I don't think they're in a rush to pull Peyton Ramsey off the field. And Ramsey seems like such a careful quarterback. If he's making mistakes, it's probably not going to be, like Richard Lego, Xander Diamont style mistakes. It's going to be more like, well, he doesn't make the throw that he should make because he's worried about committing a turnover or he's worried about, doing something wrong, which can sometimes be just as damaging offensively. So I think it's a really tricky situation for Tom Allen and Mike DeBoard because, you've got a very efficient quarterback in Peyton Ramsey. You got a guy who doesn't turn the ball over that much. Does that, so you can't really use the traditional mistake metric as a guidepost about whether to pull a guy out or not.
This is one of the things I'm not concerned about from our coaching staff. I mean, there are things that I am, but this is not something I am because you look, I mean, you had a similar situation last year. Like you had a very razor thin margin to make a bowl. And the minute Lego started having trouble, I mean, game 2 against Virginia, they yanked him and put in Peyton Ramsey. And then, it was kind of a dual quarterback system until they got to a point in the middle of the year. And it's like, all right, well, Ramsey's just really deficient in some areas. We have to go with Lego. But I mean, you saw it last year. I mean, this is the exact same situation. And Tom Allen didn't really dick around. Like he pulled Lego and put in Ramsey right away in the Virginia game. So this is one area where I think Tom Allen's not going to let him play it through if he feels like it's going to jeopardize one of the wins we have to get.
As we continue on here, it's been interesting watching some of the comments coming in because a lot of you had some really good questions about some of the various aspects of this team. Another question that we got coming in from Theo: where does Indiana turn to get a regular feature running back? We don't have a Jordan Howard type of back or a Tevin Coleman. I mean, that's true. Those are kind of generational backs, and to be fair, we were very lucky to get even one of them, let alone both. I mean, it literally took the Alabama legislature shutting down an entire football program out of spite for Jordan Howard to come to IU. So, it's tough to look at the IU running back situation and say, oh, how do we get another Tevin Coleman or another Jordan Howard? I mean, those guys really don't grow on trees. That said,
I mean, we were asking that question after Anthony Thompson and Von Dunbar. It's like we've been asking that for 20 years, and then we just had it. So I guess wait another 20 years and we'll get it.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't quite 20 years. It was more than that, actually. It was closer to 20, 22, 23. Yeah. But look, I'll say this. I think there's talented backs that IU has in their backfield. I don't think they're quite to that level. But I don't think they need that sort of a feature back necessarily right now. Certainly be nice to have. But I think that they've got enough of a stable of backs between Stevie Scott and Mike Majette and Ricky Brookings that, I don't know that any individual is going to rush for 100 yards, whereas I thought that was certainly an opportunity with Ellison and maybe even Cole Guest, given what he had showed before. But I think there's enough talent available and enough of a rotation that IU will be able to put together a decent running back by committee situation. And I think the offensive line, I mean, that really ends up being the key to the situation. The problem last year for IU wasn't necessarily the running backs, as much as it was the fact that the line was very deficient. And that was one of the reasons why we were interested in seeing how Ellison was going to play, to see how he played behind a more traditionally good offensive line. And so I wouldn't worry too much about it, but I think that, there were a lot of factors that kind of came together at once that made the Tevin Coleman experience a possibility, not just Tevin Coleman, but also the running backs coach that was at IU at the time, who's no longer here. He's in the NFL now. So that's how I would answer that question. Couple other questions that we had from Twitter before we wrap things up. And this is a good one for you, Scott. This one from Jim Hoff. IU recently removed names from the backs of jerseys. The chrome striped helmets are also not going to be used this year. So will IU football ever use the oval logo again for a throwback?
Wait, did they officially say no chrome striped helmets?
That's the first I've heard, but I guess that's the case. Yeah, I mean, I hadn't seen anything specific on that, and hopefully that's not the case. But
That sucks. Those are fun.
I know. Well, I maybe they were too flashy. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I would say this, Jim. I mean, I with IU football, you can never say never. I mean, you know, there's really not a bunch of sacred stuff. Like we talk about the names on jerseys. It's like we had no names on jerseys in the late 80s. Like this kind of comes like IU football really has no one thing where it's like that's IU football, damn it. Like there is no candy stripe pants for IU football where it's like we got to hold this sacred. And so I don't.
Just to clarify, Jim is correct. This report from Michael Moreau of the AP
that sucks.
Indicated that they ordered new helmets and they switched out stickers, but they're not going to use the rotating helmets this year. They're going to so they're going to add a second helmet choice next year, but right now they're just going to use the same helmet all the way through.
That sucks. But I mean, here's the thing. I don't think we're going to see the Oval logo anytime soon. That said, I mean, never say never. I mean, they could do a retro thing. I mean,
well, I mean, the problem is this: like the Oval is it only has any sort of sentimental attachment for a very small selection of the IU fan base, and that's basically you and me and right. People that went to school around the same time that we did.
Or anybody who's like, if they wanted to do a big like Antoine Randall day and like a throwback, like that's an Antoine Randall uniform.
Yeah,
like
it is.
I would say that's the only thing that's keeping it like if Antwell did, like if it was like 01 to 04 they had the Oval, I'd say no way. But at least if you wanted to do like an Antoine Randall throwback day or something, like you might be able to get one game out of it. I mean, I think it's very minimal. I think we're more likely to see the Bison back as the mascot than we are seeing the Oval as the logo.
And I will say this, like you have to keep in mind that, 1998 was a very different time in terms of branding and marketing. And the idea today that you would have a completely different logo for your football team as you would from the rest of your athletic department is completely anathema to the way that athletic departments are run. Not just at IU, I mean, anywhere. Yeah, certainly you'll get programs like Oregon that have a whole bunch of different uniform types, but their core branding principles are going to stay consistent throughout. And IU's no different than that. So, even as a throwback, I'd be shocked because it's just so completely different from anything else in the stable that I just don't see there being any push from inside for it to be utilized.
And quick history lesson. This is something Galen and I have talked about many times off podcasts, just kicking around. We both went to school at this time. We're both into sports media. We were both into the sports media IU department at the time. This is when I think it's fair to say almost every athletic team at IU in 98 had a different logo and a different font, and in some cases, different colors. Like football had the Oval and they were in their own world. Basketball had its own pitchfork that it used and its own font that it used. And then like other sport, like literally there was no one design across the athletics. It was insane.
It was a different time all the way around. Before we finish up with the Virginia game, a couple of players to watch for those who haven't really done a lot of scouting on Virginia. Obviously, keep an eye on the running game. Jordan Ellis, their senior running back. This is a guy who rushed for, I think, 146 yards last week. And, this is a player that certainly was fairly successful last year. He had 836 yards total last season. He only rushed for 44 yards against IU. And that was like his second or third worst game of the whole year. The only other teams that he rushed for that few yards against were Virginia Tech, who's a pretty good team, and Miami, where he only rushed for about 2 yards a carry. So he's a guy to certainly keep an eye on in this contest. I would also keep an eye on Bryce Perkins, the quarterback. This is a guy who is brand new, but had a pretty good game overall in terms of what he was able to do. Passing wise, 13 of 24, 185 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. And then he also rushed 13 times for 108 yards. So that's a guy that could present some issues. And then defensively, some players on Virginia's squad that are worth keeping an eye on. Jordan Mack, the linebacker, he was, I think, 5th in the ACC last year, had 114 tackles. Bryce Hall, the cornerback, he's probably their best player in their secondary, 6 tackles, a sack, and a forced fumble against Richmond. And then probably their best blocker, Marcus Applefield, the offensive lineman. So just some players to keep an eye on. One thing also to keep in mind, Vegas has IU as a either 6 or 6.5 point favorite in this contest, which I'm kind of curious about. Certainly IU beat Virginia last year, but if you look at the S&P Plus ratings, which we are big fans of here, that's the rating that Bill Connolly over at SB Nation does, Virginia should actually be favored in this game. Virginia's 43rd in the latest S&P Plus ratings, whereas IU, I think, is 58th. And at this point, I think Virginia should be like a 2-3 point favorite based upon that. So there's some kind of inefficiency in the betting market here. I'm not sure if it's the weather, if it's the road game, or if it's some other factor. But it's something certainly to keep an eye on if you're the type of person that would place a wager on the game. Jason Kennedy asking aloud in the chat, I wonder what Vegas will do regarding over-under and spread given the weather. It's an interesting question, and I don't think anybody really knows yet because, as if we go back and look at the what the current setup is. In fact, let me call up what the over-under is at this point.
What is it?
I've got it here somewhere. Here we go. According to the latest Vegas odds, the over-under on this one. This is great radio here right now. It's shifting a little bit. So
anything over 40, I'm taking the under.
It opened. So this will tell you. It opened at 54.
Oh, under. Anything under 42, I'm taking the under.
It opened at 54. It's already dropped to 51 or 51.5, depending on the book. And I'm imagining it's probably going to go down a little bit more. What's interesting is even with that shift, IU is still favored by pretty much 6.5 across the board now. There's only 2 books. I think the Win and Bet Online are the only 2 that have IU as only a 6 point favorite. So I think that's really interesting. That's something to keep an eye on. So with all that said, Scott, what is your score prediction for this contest, and what should we be looking at?
I predict rain.
Okay.
Not pain, but rain. I think it's going to be wet, Galen. It's weird. I think we're going to see a good amount of turnovers. I think this game is going to be similar to one of the most painful games I ever sat through, the Indiana-Penn State game that year. We had Xander Diamond as starting quarterback, and we lost 13-10. And just like it was literally just a punting battle. I think both teams are going to have a hard time moving the ball. I think it's going to be sloppy and messy. So I would say, but I do think IU's going to win. I would say IU wins. I'll say 21-13.
Okay. I agree. It's going to be a sloppy game. I think IU is going to be a little better prepared.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Last thing. I think attendance will probably be somewhere in like the 20,000 range.
It's going to be tough to tell. I mean, if the weather's really that bad, and trust me, I hope this whole thing moves, and I hope it clears up, and we're able to get a tailgate in. But if this thing doesn't move, and this amount of rain dumps on it, it's going to be really hard to get a lot of people out there. 20,000 might actually be a little bit optimistic. Game-wise, I think IU has a little bit of an advantage in this contest in that I think they've got better overall skill position players, and I think that their line is probably better. I believe that combined with the fact that Virginia is having to travel on the road, this is a significant step up in competition. I think a much greater step up in competition for Virginia than for IU, given their respective opponents last week. I think it's going to be sloppy. I think IU is going to struggle to get down the field, but I also think Virginia will have similar issues. So I'm in a similar boat as you. I'm going to say a weird score because I think there's going to be some trouble with extra points and so forth, but I'll say like 19-16 Indiana.
Okay. That's a weird score.
I said it would be weird. I didn't lie.
That falls under weird.
We had one last question from Jay Horry, friend of the pod. Can I get a basketball update? Okay, thanks. So just to tag on here at the very end, if you're not into basketball right now, feel free to turn off the podcast. But big news today for IU basketball, a couple of big things of news. They sign a recruit, 4-star recruit out of Cathedral High School, Armand Franklin. This is a guy that pretty much everybody thought was going to Purdue, and then IU parachutes in at the last second and grabs him. Beyond the hilarious implications of that, obviously, Scott, which we should certainly revel in as much as possible. That's the first recruit for next year's cycle for the Indiana Hoosiers, and it's a position of need. Franklin, a 6'4" combo guard, maybe not as good of an outside shooter as some other potential recruits they were looking at that position, but a good all-around player. And once IU started zeroing in on him, they really jumped in with both feet. And seems like a guy that has a lot of potential. So I'm quite fascinated to see how this turns out.
Here's what I like about the recruits we're getting. Who else was, like you said, Purdue? Who else was recruiting? Xavier. I mean, again, we're getting back up to the level of competition that we're going up against other schools that are like us or better than us.
Not beating out Incarnate Word.
Or Mercer or Texas Southern State. Yeah, no, I mean, I would say we should look at ourselves better than Xavier, but it's always great to beat out Purdue on a recruit like that. I mean, just continue to grow the class. It's good, and early too, early in the cycle.
Early too, and still, almost 3 full weeks, actually a little over 3 full weeks before Hoosier Hysteria. There was an announcement today that's going to be held. I guess that's starting at 4 p.m. on Saturday the 29th. So that's positive, and that'll be interesting. Kind of an earlier start to that than what we're used to. And it's going to be interesting to see how that juggles with the IU Rutgers football game that's taking place that day on the road. It's not in Bloomington, so they won't be like sharing a parking lot or anything like that, thankfully. But
Hoosier Hysteria is so early this year.
It's very early, but I'm ready for it. And from a recruiting standpoint, which is why I brought it up, there's going to be some recruits there. You can check out the names on some of the various message boards, but a couple of really top level recruits that IU is trying to hone in on are going to be there for that event. Trace Jackson Davis out of Greenwood, and then I think Jarius Ramsey is supposed to be there as well, probably a couple of other people. So big goings on from a recruiting perspective for IU on the basketball scene. Should be interesting to see how they develop and see who else commits here over the course of the next couple of months.
Yeah, how many spots do they have open for the?
Well, technically right now there's 3, which I think includes the Romeo Langford piece. But we've seen this before. You get guys transferring or things happen here or there. So 3 is kind of the minimum number that they need, and it'll be
3 with Franklin, or Franklin's one of the 3.
Franklin's one of the 3.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see how the rest of it pans out.
Yeah.
One other big news from basketball: all of the times were announced for basketball games for the whole season. So you've got dates and times for all the IU games. One thing that's worth noting: IU's senior day is going to be held Sunday, March 10th. Against Rutgers. It's a noon tip. And that's, normally that wouldn't be that big of news, but the problem is that's right at the beginning of spring break for IU students. Spring break is kind of a week early this year for some reason. So spring break will actually end up for a lot of students starting like the 7th or 8th or the 6th, like, whatever that previous week when their classes end. So it'll be an odd senior night in that there won't be any students in the stands, or very few. So that'll be something to keep an eye on.
That's crazy, because the entire time I've lived in Bloomington, gone to IU, spring break was always the first week of the NCAA tournament, and now it'll be the week of Big Ten tournament. Yeah,
it is definitely not what normal. We grew up with, but I think it's just one of those one-off odd things. Like normally, I think next year it goes back to the regular cycle. This isn't an IU thing. This is just the way that the calendar breaks down. It's a very late NCAA tournament this year. So
yeah, it's also nice to not have the week off, or the week of Big Ten tournament the week before.
Jason Kennedy asked if Moses Abraham is going to be at Hoosier Hysteria. I was expecting a bigger laugh out of you, Scott. I'm thinking BJ Anya will definitely be there. To see how many other blasts from the past we can get into Hoosier Hysteria. We should just invite them all back. Anyway, all right. I think that'll wrap things up. Thanks to all of you for tuning in, either live here on YouTube or after the fact on thehoosier.com. Be sure to check out thehoosier.com throughout the course of the season. That's where we're hosting our podcasts, and that's where you can find expert commentary and analysis from Jordan Wells, Stu Jackson, and the rest of the crew over there. Scott, enjoy yourself. Stay dry. Yeah. Stay dry. Absolutely. You folks stay dry out there as well. And we'll catch you all on the flip side. So long, everybody.